It happened in a room full of people. No warning, no transition, just a slide in the middle of a quarterly update presentation. Regional roles restructured for cost efficiency. My name wasn't spoken, but my title, Director of Western Operations, disappeared in real time, replaced by a vague heading that said, Streamlined Leadership Model. I sat 2 rows from the front, pen in hand, notes half written. I didn't look around. I didn't react. I just stared at the screen and waited for someone to explain. No one did. After the meeting, Victor, our newly appointed COO, approached me with a smile too quick to be sincere. "We're aligning for scale," he said. "Lean structure is the future. This isn't about performance, it's about efficiency." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I understood the script. I'd heard it before, in articles, in podcasts, in sanitized press releases from other companies. It's the story they tell when they want to erase you without sounding cruel. The next morning, I received an internal email. "Your new role, Senior Project Support, Western Region. No team, no leadership responsibilities, no budget control, just support." I had led that region for 4 years, expanded client acquisition by 170%, built a 3-layer team structure that had cut onboarding time by half, stabilized operations in the most volatile territory the company had. Now I was a line item they decided to streamline. I didn't reply to the email. I didn't protest. I showed up to the new desk they assigned me, smaller, closer to the hallway with no nameplate. And I did the one thing they didn't expect. I stayed. Not because I was holding on, but because I was observing. At first, there was pity, then avoidance, then silence. Most people didn't know what to say. Some believed the cost-cutting story. Others knew better but didn't want to get involved. That's how erasure works best. Not by loud removal, but by quiet redesign. 2 weeks later, I heard it through someone on the HR team. They'd hired someone new, a man. Same title I once held. No internal posting, no interview, just an announcement. "Excited to welcome Michael Grant as Director of Western Operations. Salary package leaked by accident, $285,000. Full benefits, relocation, signing bonus." When I saw the number, I didn't flinch. I just did the math. It was nearly double what I'd been making in the same role. I printed the offer email someone forwarded me, unsigned, unrequested, and slipped it into a folder labeled Baseline. That night, I didn't cry, I didn't vent. I opened my laptop, pulled up my own performance reviews, and created a single document. I called it What Was Built. Because if they were going to replace me, I wanted to make sure there was a record, not of what I lost, but of what they were trying to inherit without understanding. Michael's arrival was greeted with the kind of optimism people reserve for untested promises. Polished resume, Ivy League degree, confident handshake. He moved into the corner office I once sat in. Same view, new furniture. He reintroduced the team to structures they already knew, renamed strategies I had designed, and called for a culture reset. No one said anything, but I saw the glances in the hallway, the stiffness in the meetings. The people I had led for years were now being managed by a man who didn't know their work, didn't ask about their process, and didn't notice what had kept the region afloat for so long. I said nothing. I answered when asked, delivered what was required, but I didn't step in because I knew what they were trying to do. They weren't just replacing a leader. They were rewriting a narrative, one where I had simply grown too close to the work, where leadership needed new energy, where cost reduction wasn't a cover for erasure, it was strategy. But you can't erase the roots of something that still functions. And the systems I built weren't going to collapse overnight just because my name had been removed from the org chart, so I waited and watched. I observed Michael introduce concepts we'd long implemented. He called them initiatives, pitched minor process tweaks as innovation, shared updates in meetings where half the team had heard the exact language before, through me. Some noticed, some didn't. Most just nodded, unsure whether it was safer to pretend it was new or risk pointing out what had already existed. One day, during a regional sync, Michael struggled to explain a reporting delay. The dashboard he referenced hadn't been updated. It was one I had created, but no one had assigned maintenance since I was removed. He looked to the analyst team. They looked to me. I didn't speak. I just sent the updated file 5 minutes later, quietly, directly. No comment, just clarity. He thanked me in passing. and moved on. But the room had shifted, not in noise, in weight. In that moment, they remembered where structure came from. That week, a client I had worked with for years sent me a private note. "Is everything okay? Feels like we're being rerouted through someone who's still catching up." I replied simply, "Yes, I'm still here if you need anything." I didn't copy leadership. I didn't escalate because I understood what was happening. They had demoted me for the sake of cost, then paid twice as much to cover the cracks I had once sealed without recognition. It wasn't a mistake. It was a calculation. And now I was letting them live inside the math. I still had my badge, my access, my clarity. But what they no longer had was the shield I used to provide them without being asked, and they were just beginning to feel the absence of it. I stopped finishing his work, not out of pride, out of precision. Michael, for all his presence, was used to having support systems absorb the fallout of his oversight. Assistants who prepped, analysts who rewrote, people who protected his title with the invisible labor of translation. I had been that buffer once, quietly aligning broken communication, fixing flawed structures before they reached the surface. Now I let the flaws land exactly where they belonged. When Michael forgot a delivery timeline during an ops review, I didn't interrupt. When he reused a miscalculated metric in a client report, I didn't fix it. When he deferred responsibility to inherited inefficiencies, I let the silence speak for itself. And in that silence, the truth became audible. It started small. A missed benchmark here. A misaligned target there. People noticed, but didn't name it. They asked more questions in side chats, paused longer in meetings, looked around before offering feedback, because everyone sensed it. The system wasn't broken, but the center had shifted. And what was holding it up now wasn't enough. I kept my routine exact, arrived on time, delivered what was requested. But I stopped protecting the facade. I let my absence become instructional. I didn't push back against the demotion. I didn't defend my contribution. I simply made room for the weight of my work to settle back into view. One morning, I reopened a folder I hadn't touched in weeks. It held every regional policy I had authored, every timeline, every escalation protocol. I created a new index, dated each version, cross-referenced every framework. I didn't do it for nostalgia, I did it for alignment. Because when the moment came, and it always does, I didn't want to argue my relevance. I wanted it to stand, fully formed, ready. Meanwhile, Michael started holding more one-on-ones. Not with leadership, with the staff, soft check-ins, casual tone. But I knew what he was looking for. Leverage, insight, control. People smiled, nodded, answered vaguely. But they started coming to me afterward, quietly, carefully. "He doesn't really know what we do. He keeps asking about things we already tried. Didn't you write that resource guide he's referencing?" I didn't confirm. I didn't deny. I just said, "Let me know if you need clarity." Because that was the difference now. I wasn't trying to rebuild their trust. I was letting them rediscover who had earned it. The company had spent more to replace me, but they had forgotten the part that couldn't be bought: continuity. And I was still here, not to reclaim, but to remind. The numbers began to shift. Not catastrophically, just enough to send the first tremor. A slight drop in retention, a delay in quarterly reporting, a widening gap between client expectation and internal delivery, the kind of changes that don't make headlines but accumulate quietly until someone has to ask, "When did this start?" Michael tried to stay ahead of it. He hosted more collaborative stand-ups, reorganized a few processes, introduced a flashy dashboard with automated metrics. But the team didn't trust it. They still used the legacy spreadsheet I had built because they knew it worked. I didn't comment. I didn't correct. I just watched. Because strategy isn't about shouting what's broken. It's about letting the cracks widen just enough for the light to get in. One afternoon, a junior manager I had trained years ago stopped me by the elevator. "I don't get it," she said. "If they demoted you to save money, why'd they pay him more than you ever made?" I looked at her. "Because they thought no one would notice." She didn't respond. She didn't have to. That same week, I noticed more of my internal documentation being referenced in meetings. Sometimes without attribution, sometimes with awkward phrasing, as if they knew it came from me but weren't sure if they were allowed to say so. It didn't bother me. It confirmed what I already knew. The structure held, even when the nameplate was gone. Meanwhile, Michael asked me to review a client proposal he had drafted. Fresh eyes, he said. I read it carefully, returned it with 5 questions. Not criticisms, just the kind of clarifying questions that reveal whether someone understands what they're offering. He didn't reply, but in the next meeting, he didn't present it. He deferred, said they were refining the approach. The truth was becoming too hard to manage. You can only perform competence for so long before real decisions have to be made. I still hadn't spoken to Victor, but I could feel his attention circling back. He asked someone on my old team about a workflow I had designed. Sat in on a meeting he used to skip. His silence was no longer avoidance. It was assessment. The shift was underway. Quiet, cautious, unofficial. But I had seen it before, and I knew what came next. Not confrontation, not admission. Just the slow return of responsibility to the one who had never actually lost it. I was ready, not to reclaim what had been taken, but to make sure that when the structure came undone, no one could pretend it hadn't been built better before, and no one could deny who had built it. It started with a message from a client, not an escalation, just a question. Who should we be talking to for a strategic continuity? Feels like there's been a shift. I read the email twice before replying. Short. Director. You've been routed to a new lead. Let me know if you need a transition brief. They responded within an hour. Actually, we'd prefer to wait until that's sorted. That word, sorted, carried more weight than it seemed. It meant something is misaligned. It meant someone doesn't trust what's been handed to them. It meant the handover hadn't worked, and they weren't willing to pretend it had. I didn't forward the email. I didn't bring it up in meetings. I simply documented the interaction, not for defense, for record. Because I could feel it now, not as resentment, but as gravity. The structure was shifting, not because I pulled it, but because it was uneven without me. Across the team, things got quieter. Feedback slowed, timelines blurred, decisions took longer. Michael began rescheduling key meetings without explanation. His once confident voice on calls began to soften. He asked for more prep time, more alignment meetings, more air cover. And people noticed, not just the ones closest to the work, but those who once believed the title meant understanding. One of the senior partners, who had always been distant, asked me in passing, "How's the new reporting structure working out?" I looked at him. It's still finding its footing. It wasn't sarcasm, it was restraint, and he heard it. "Let me know if there's anything we're missing," he said, happy to take a second look. The second look was already happening. Not officially, but in murmurs, in questions, in the realization that the person being paid more wasn't producing more, but depending on what I had left behind. And what I hadn't touched since being removed was unraveling. A dashboard flagged incorrect data. A team duplicated work by accident. A client withdrew from a planned expansion. No one could link it to one decision, because it wasn't one. It was the result of a system built on the quiet effort of someone they had decided was replaceable. Now, the gap between cost and consequence was becoming visible. They had demoted me for efficiency, then spent twice as much to try and replicate something they didn't fully understand. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't call attention to it. I just kept doing the one thing they couldn't manage without, anchoring what worked, and slowly, what didn't began to sink. The metrics arrived before the excuses. Q2 performance dropped below forecast for the first time in 3 years. Client churn ticked upward, modest but consistent. Internal surveys flagged confusion around ownership and morale. The story was no longer a feeling. It was a pattern. Victor sent out a message to all directors. We're initiating a cross-functional leadership review to ensure strategic alignment. Clean, polite, fractured. The kind of language people use when the truth is too politically messy to name. Michael, once so visible, began fading into the background. He stopped leading the all-hands, delegated status updates, canceled more meetings than he kept, and the ones he did attend felt thinner, as if he knew his presence no longer carried the certainty it once did. The team filled the space differently now. More of them started looping me in again. Just for continuity. Thought you'd want visibility. Could use your eyes on this. It wasn't formal. It wasn't even coordinated. It was organic, quiet, a slow reversion to the structure that had always worked before the titles got rearranged. I didn't make a show of it. I didn't correct or claim. I just responded, clean, clear, steady. One day during a client strategy session, the account lead paused mid-call. A question had come up about a framework they'd implemented last year. Michael froze, looked to me. I answered, simple, exact. The client nodded. That's what I needed. The call moved on, but the moment didn't, because everyone saw it. Not as failure, but as fragility. Not because Michael was malicious, but because he was miscast. And even he knew it now. A week later, Diane from HR messaged me. Just between us, there's talk of transition. Watch your calendar. I replied with 2 words. I'm ready. Not because I wanted the job back, but because I wanted clarity to land where it belonged. I had spent months standing still, not in passivity, but in preparation. And now, the unraveling was nearly complete. They'd tried to replace function with optics, replace systems with surface, replace me with someone they thought looked like leadership. But the cost had come due, and not just in dollars, in trust, in time. In talent quietly drifting away because they no longer believed in the stories being told. I didn't need to remind anyone what had happened. It was already showing up in the numbers. And when the numbers speak, even the most curated narrative has to pause. They had made a choice, and now they were living in its aftermath. I had made a choice too, to stay, to watch, and to let the collapse unfold without ever raising my voice. It was a Wednesday morning when the first real crack appeared. Michael called an emergency meeting with the leadership team. No agenda, just a check-in about Q3 targets. The room was quieter than usual. He arrived a few minutes late, eyes darting between the team like he was searching for a direction he wasn't sure was there. The data had been delayed. A client had already pushed back a deadline. The numbers he had once proudly shared were no longer aligning. He opened the meeting with his usual optimism, but it didn't land. We're hitting a few bumps, he said, tapping nervously on his tablet, but we can recover. No one answered. Everyone waited for him to elaborate, to show us how we could recover when the framework that had been in place for years was now visibly broken. I didn't speak. There was nothing I needed to say. The numbers had already made it clear. But what was more telling than Michael's faltering tone was the visible discomfort in the room. People shifted in their seats, exchanged nervous glances. No one believed in the story anymore. Not the clients, not the team, not even the board. And that's when the realization hit. This wasn't just about bad results. It was about broken trust. The trust they had placed in a system that was now failing because it had been built on the wrong premise. That optics, and not substance, could carry them forward. One by one, people started speaking up. Not to challenge Michael directly, but to raise questions about timelines, about quality, about the way forward. There were no answers, only more deflections. When the meeting ended, I didn't stay to listen to the usual, "we'll get them next time" pep talk. I simply walked back to my office, opened my email. My inbox was flooded with inquiries. What's happening with Q3? Are we shifting targets? Is leadership changing? And there it was, the question I had been waiting for. Are you coming back to help with the strategy realignment? It wasn't from Victor. It wasn't from Michael. It was from a long-term client, one I had personally brought in years ago, one whose trust had been hard-earned. I paused, not because I was unsure of my response, but because the question had already answered itself. The strategy wasn't working anymore. They were looking for a steady hand. They were looking for me. But I wasn't going to answer until they had acknowledged the gap, until they realized what they had lost. And more importantly, until they realized what it would take to rebuild. The collapse wasn't going to happen overnight, but the foundation had cracked, and I was just waiting for them to see it before stepping in. By the time the quarterly review arrived, the collapse was no longer an internal matter, it was on paper. The client satisfaction scores had dropped another 4 points. The project pipeline was thinning. 2 high-value accounts had quietly withdrawn from expansion plans. And the cost? It was undeniable now. We hadn't saved money. We had lost momentum. The board scheduled an emergency strategy session. This time, I was invited. No title attached, just my name. The message read, "Your insight would be helpful." I accepted. not because I wanted vindication, but because the moment required clarity, and clarity had always been mine. The session was held in the main boardroom. Victor was there, so was Diane, and Michael, seated at the far end of the table, shoulders slightly hunched, face carefully neutral. No one said what had gone wrong. They didn't need to. It was written in the hesitation, in the thinly veiled phrases like transition fatigue, role ambiguity, and misaligned execution. I stayed quiet through most of it, taking notes, listening. Then, halfway through the meeting, a partner asked the question no one else would. Do we have any evidence the previous model was underperforming before the leadership change? Silence. Then a quiet, clipped response from Michael. It wasn't about performance. It was about future readiness. A convenient phrase, but the data didn't support it, and everyone knew. I waited a beat, then opened a folder I had prepared 2 weeks earlier, titled simply Pre-Realignment Framework, Performance Comparison. Inside were metrics, benchmarks, client testimonials, a full timeline of what had been working before it was dismantled. I didn't hand it to anyone. I slid it to the center of the table. This might help clarify what changed and what didn't. Victor cleared his throat. We appreciate that. But the tone had already shifted. For the first time in months, the room wasn't managing optics. It was searching for truth. 2 days later, the internal memo was released. Michael was transitioning out of his role to pursue new opportunities. There was no thank you note, no round of applause, just silence. The same kind of silence they had once offered me. Except now it sounded heavier. A week after that, Victor requested a one-on-one. The board wants to reset, and they want it built on what works, on what we had, with you. I didn't respond immediately, because the question wasn't whether I would come back. It was whether they were truly ready for what I had always brought. Consistency without theatrics, results without noise. If I return, I said, it won't be to fix what was broken. It will be to build something clean, something that doesn't depend on personality to survive. He nodded. Understood. I walked out of that room not as a returning leader, not as someone reclaiming her seat, but as someone who had never needed it to begin with. Because everything I had once been asked to defend was now asking for me by name, not out of pity, out of necessity. I didn't return to my old title. I didn't ask for back pay. I didn't demand a public correction. What I asked for was structure, a clean scope, real authority, and a line drawn between what had been tolerated and what I would now allow. They agreed, quickly, quietly, without hesitation, not because they had become generous, because they had become aware. They now understood what it cost to replace experience with impression, depth with decoration, and this time they weren't willing to repeat that mistake. I accepted the offer, not as a reinstatement, but as a redesign. Same territory, same clients, but on my terms. The new contract had no echoes of the old role, no lingering condescension, just space to lead, and accountability written into every line. I moved into a new office, smaller than the one I used to have, but near the people I trusted. The window overlooked the floor I'd once walked with lowered eyes. Now I stood straighter. Not because I'd proven anything, but because I no longer needed their acknowledgement to feel anchored. My first month back, I didn't change much. I listened, realigned the broken pieces, gave people space to speak now that the noise had faded. They didn't ask what happened to Michael, and I didn't bring him up. Legacy isn't about the one who replaced you. It's about what happens after they try and fail. One afternoon, a junior colleague dropped by. She looked hesitant, notebook in hand. Can I ask something? I nodded. How did you stay through all of it? I thought for a moment. Because I never let them tell me who I was. She wrote it down. Not for show, for survival. I watched her leave and it struck me. The most lasting thing we leave behind isn't the title or the timeline. It's the permission we give others to stay true to themselves, even when systems try to write them out. I wasn't trying to become a symbol. I was just trying to hold my line. But in holding it, I had drawn one for others too. One they could stand behind when the structure shifted again. Because it always does. 3 months passed, the numbers rebounded. Client satisfaction rose, retention stabilized. The dashboard Michael had tried to replace was back in use. Quietly reinstated, never formally acknowledged, the board stopped asking questions. Not because they found new answers, but because the results had returned. And results are the language power listens to when it's too proud to admit it was wrong. I didn't speak of the past. I didn't need to. The absence had done the talking for me. And the return didn't need a name. It only needed to work. One morning, Diane stopped by my office. She placed a small envelope on my desk. "Someone dropped this off during your meeting," she said. No name, no message, just a printed card with 8 words. "You didn't lose. They just couldn't replace you." I sat with those words longer than I expected, not because they felt triumphant, but because they felt true. Not dramatic, just final. The system hadn't apologized. It hadn't reversed course with a press release, but it had corrected itself through necessity, through failure, through the quiet, undeniable pull of the person who'd once kept everything moving, and then stopped. I didn't need recognition. I had reach. I didn't need applause. I had accuracy. And now every decision I made echoed back not as authority, but as alignment. Because the team no longer followed orders. They followed steadiness, and they knew exactly where to find it. One evening, as I packed up for the day, a new hire knocked lightly on my open door. "Do you have a second?" "Sure." She hesitated, then stepped inside. "Someone told me you were replaced before?" I nodded. "I was." "And now you're back?" I smiled. "Number I'm forward." She blinked, then smiled too. Smaller, but real. "I hope I get to build that kind of trust." "You will," I said. "Just don't let anyone convince you it's optional." She left, and I stood alone in my office. Light fading through the window, nothing spectacular, just a day ending in clarity. And that was enough, because legacy, I had learned, isn't about what you reclaim. It's about what you leave behind, intact, even after they try to erase it. And in this space, quiet, efficient, whole, everything they tried to replace was still here. Still mine. Still working.